Good evening and welcome to the channel. Tonight we are going to examine one of the most damaging intelligence failures in recent American military history. Not a failure of satellite imagery, not a failure of signals intelligence, not a failure of human sources inside Iran. A failure of strategic imagination, a failure to ask the most obvious question that any war planner attacking Iran was obligated to answer before the first bomb fell on February 28th. What happens if Iran closes the Strait of Hormuz? That question was asked. The answer that came back was wrong, and the cost of that wrong answer is being paid today by every person on Earth who buys gasoline, who pays for heating, who buys food that was grown with fertilizer that comes from Gulf energy facilities, who works in an industry that depends on oil. Multiple sources familiar with the matter told CNN, and CNN published this on March 12th, that the Pentagon and the National Security Council significantly underestimated Iran's willingness to close the Strait of Hormuz in response to U.S. military strikes while planning the ongoing operation. President Donald Trump's national security team failed to fully account for the potential consequences of what some officials have described as a worst-case scenario now facing the administration. Three sources told CNN's reporters that top Trump administration officials acknowledged to lawmakers during recent classified briefings that they did not plan for the possibility of Iran closing the strait in response to strikes. And then, when those officials were asked about this in public, the White House called the story 100% fake news. Hegseth called it patently ridiculous. And Senator Tom Cotton said whoever leaked this lied. Subscribe to this channel right now and turn on notifications, because what we are documenting here is a pattern that every student of American military history will recognize. A war launched on assumptions that turned out to be wrong. A war whose planners told themselves the worst case would not happen. A war whose economic consequences are now being lived by hundreds of millions of people who had no vote in the decision that produced them. Before going further, it is necessary to establish precisely what the intelligence failure was, what the assumption was that turned out to be wrong, and why that assumption was made, because the story is more specific and more revealing than the summary version that most coverage is transmitting. The assumption was this: Iran would not close the Strait of Hormuz because doing so would hurt Iran more than it would hurt the United States. Sources told the Daily Beast that the administration did not expect Iran to close the passage because it believed doing so would hurt Iran more than the U.S. Officials argued that the view was justified because Iran did not close the passage when the U.S. targeted Iran's nuclear facilities with airstrikes in June 2025. The logic was precise. The United States is now the world's largest oil producer. American energy markets are less exposed to Gulf oil than they were 20 years ago. Iran had not closed Hormuz during last summer's 12-day war. Therefore, Iran would not close Hormuz this time either. That was the calculation. It was wrong in a specific and documentable way, and understanding why it was wrong tells you something important about how strategic planning fails in the real world. The first problem with the assumption is that the June 2025 12-day war and Operation Epic Fury are not comparable scenarios. In June 2025, the United States struck Iran's nuclear facilities in a targeted operation. It did not kill Iran's supreme leader. It did not kill Iran's defense minister. It did not kill Iran's IRGC commander. It did not begin a sustained bombing campaign against thousands of targets across Iran's military, energy, and command infrastructure. It struck specific facilities and stopped. The Iranian response to that limited operation and the Iranian response to having its supreme leader assassinated on the first day of a sustained war are not the same decision calculus. The planners who used June 2025 as their baseline for predicting Iranian behavior in Operation Epic Fury were using the wrong reference point. The escalation from a targeted nuclear strike to an all-out regime decapitation campaign fundamentally changed. the strategic logic facing Iranian commanders. When your supreme leader has just been killed, when your defense minister has been killed, when your IRGC commander has been killed, when your country is under the most intensive bombardment it has faced since the Iran-Iraq war, the question you are asking is not whether closing Hormuz hurts Iran more than the United States. The question you are asking is what leverage do we have that will impose maximum cost on the people who are bombing us? And the answer to that question is the Strait of Hormuz. It has always been the answer. The planners should have known it would be the answer. The second problem with the assumption is the one that is most damaging for the credibility of the planning process itself. Trump's preference for leaning on a tight circle of close advisors in his national security decision-making, CNN reported, had the effect of sidelining interagency debate over the potential economic fallout if Iran were to respond to U.S.-Israeli strikes by closing the strait. While key officials from the Departments of Energy and Treasury were present for some of the official planning meetings, sources said, the agency analysis and forecasts that would be integral elements of the decision-making process in past administrations were secondary considerations. That sentence is the most important sentence in the entire CNN report. Not that the Hormuz closure was unanticipated, that the process by which it should have been anticipated was bypassed. Interagency debate exists for a reason. It exists because different agencies bring different analytical perspectives to the same problem. Treasury brings economic modeling. Energy brings supply chain analysis. State brings diplomatic assessment of how allies will respond. Intelligence agencies bring classified threat assessments. When you sideline interagency debate, you sideline the mechanism by which the worst-case scenario gets stress-tested against the best-case assumption. You create an echo chamber where the people who want to do the operation are primarily talking to other people who want to do the operation. And in that echo chamber, the assumption that Iran would not close Hormuz because it would hurt Iran more than the United States survived because it was never subjected to the systematic challenge that an interagency process would have applied to it. The third problem goes to the specific question of what intelligence was actually available about Iranian intentions before February 28th. The Strait of Hormuz Wikipedia article documents something that should have been in every pre-war briefing. Between February 15th and February 20th, during the period when the U.S. military buildup was becoming the largest in the Middle East since the 2003 invasion of Iraq, Iran increased its oil exports to 3 times their normal rate and reduced oil storage to reduce the risk of disruptions. Iran was pre-positioning. It was loading up on export revenue before what its leadership presumably calculated was an incoming conflict, and it was reducing its dependence on above-ground oil storage that could be targeted. Those are not the actions of a country that has not thought through the possibility that it might need to close the Strait of Hormuz. Those are the actions of a country that has thought through it carefully and is preparing. That preparation happened in the 2 weeks before the war started, and it was visible in shipping data that was publicly available. If it was visible in public shipping data, it was certainly visible in classified intelligence collection. The question is whether the people making the war planning assumptions were looking at it. The White House response to the CNN reporting has itself become part of the analytical record in ways that deserve examination. Caroline Leavitt called the story 100% fake news. She said the Pentagon has been planning for Iran's desperate and reckless closure of the Strait of Hormuz for decades. Pete Hegseth called the report patently ridiculous and said, of course, for decades, Iran has threatened shipping in the Strait of Hormuz. This is always what they do, hold the strait hostage. Notice what both of those responses actually say. They say the Pentagon knew Iran might close the strait. They do not say the Pentagon had a plan to reopen it. They do not say the economic modeling was done for a sustained Hormuz closure. They do not say the interagency debate produced a consensus strategy for the post-strike scenario. They say Iran has always threatened Hormuz, and the Pentagon has always planned for it in a general military sense. That is entirely consistent with the CNN report. The CNN report does not say the Pentagon never heard of Hormuz. It says the national security team significantly underestimated Iran's willingness to actually close it and failed to fully account for the potential economic consequences. Those are two different claims. The White House is denying the first claim, which no one made. It is not addressing the second claim, which is the one that matters. Now, let us look at what happened after the strait closed, because the operational timeline is more revealing than any official statement. On March 3rd, the day after the IRGC officially confirmed the strait was closed, U.S. Navy Secretary was asked when the Navy would begin escorting tankers through the strait. The U.S. Navy had reportedly refused requests from ships seeking military escorts since the start of the war because it would be too dangerous. On March 12th, Treasury Secretary Bessent told Sky News the U.S. Navy would be escorting oil tankers through the strait as soon as it is militarily possible. On March 13th, Hegseth told reporters we have been dealing with it and don't need to worry about it. On March 15th, Trump posted on Truth Social naming China, France, Japan, South Korea, and the UK as countries that should send warships to reopen the strait. On March 16th, Trump told the Financial Times NATO faces a very bad future if allies do not help. On March 17th, he said we do not need any help, actually. On March 18th, Trump posted wondering if America should just finish off Iran and let other countries be responsible for the strait themselves. That sequence of contradictory positions over 16 days is not the behavior of an administration that had a detailed plan for the post-strike scenario. It is the behavior of an administration improvising in real time against a strategic consequence it did not fully model. The economic consequences of this intelligence failure are worth quantifying precisely because they are the most direct measure of the cost of wrong assumptions. On February 27th, the day before the war began, Brent crude was trading at approximately $70 per barrel. By March 18th, it has surpassed $108 per barrel. That is a 54% increase in 19 days. American gasoline prices have risen from approximately $3 per gallon to $3.79 per gallon, a 26% increase in under 3 weeks. California prices have exceeded $5 per gallon. Gulf oil exports from the 8 major Middle Eastern producers have fallen between 60 and 70% from February levels. The IEA has declared this the largest oil supply disruption in the history of the global oil market. The inflation consequences of a sustained energy price shock of this magnitude do not materialize immediately. They work their way through supply chains, through transportation costs, through food prices, through industrial production costs over a period of months. The Federal Reserve, which had been preparing to cut interest rates in the context of falling inflation, is now paralyzed because cutting rates into an oil shock risks reigniting the very inflation it spent 2 years fighting. Every American household that was expecting lower mortgage rates and lower borrowing costs is now waiting for an outcome that cannot materialize until the Strait of Hormuz reopens. And the Strait of Hormuz will not reopen until Iran decides it is in Iran's interest to open it, which means until the bombing stops or until the terms of whatever negotiation eventually ends, this war are set. The broader question that emerges from assembling all of these elements is the one that strategic analysts across the ideological spectrum are beginning to ask with increasing urgency. Did the intelligence failure on Hormuz reflect a one-time planning gap? Or does it reflect a systematic problem with how decisions are being made in this administration? The sidelining of interagency debate that CNN described is not a one-time event. It is a structural feature of how Trump's second-term national security decision-making operates. The president prefers a tight circle. Dissenting analysis gets sidelined. The people most enthusiastic about the operation dominate the planning process. This is the exact pattern that produced the intelligence failure before Iraq 2003. Intelligence was shaped by the policy preference rather than the other way around. The worst-case scenario was minimized rather than stress-tested. And when the worst case materialized, it caught the planners by surprise. Joe Kent, Trump's own counterterrorism director, resigned 2 days ago and said in public that this war was built on a lie about the imminent threat Iran posed. Gabbard testified before the Senate today and acknowledged that the regime appears to be intact. The Strait of Hormuz is closed on day 19. Oil is at $108 per barrel, and the planning process that produced this outcome is being defended by the same officials who designed it. Before I hand it over to you, 3 questions for tonight. Question A. Multiple sources told CNN that top Trump officials acknowledged to lawmakers in classified briefings that they did not plan for Iran closing the Strait of Hormuz. The White House called this fake news. Hegseth called it patently ridiculous. But the operational evidence, 16 days of contradictory positions on how to reopen the strait, no coalition formed, no escorts running, no plan publicly visible, suggests the planning assumption was wrong. Do you believe the White House's denial or the CNN reporting? And what evidence from the past 19 days most shapes your answer? Question B. The administration sidelined interagency debate in favor of a tight circle of close advisors, and the consequence appears to be that the worst-case economic scenario was not fully modeled before the bombs fell. This is the same structural failure that produced the pre-Iraq 2003 intelligence failure. Do you think the concentration of decision-making authority in a small group of true believers is a feature of how this administration operates across all policy areas? Or was the Iran war planning an exception? And question C, the assumption that Iran would not close Hormuz because it would hurt Iran more than the United States was based partly on the precedent from June 2025, when Iran did not close the strait after the nuclear facility strikes. That precedent turned out to be the wrong baseline. What does that tell you about the danger of using historical precedent to predict enemy behavior when the scale and stakes of a new operation are fundamentally different? Leave your assessment in the comments. Evidence first, analysis second.